Hello, a very good morning to you. It's 7 o'clock. The government is resisting calls for a U-turn on the mini-budget, despite a run on the pound and the markets being plunged into turmoil. But Downing Street has moved to restore order to the public finances, with ministers told to find savings in their departments. We'll speak to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury about which services will now be cut to fund tax cuts for the highest earners. And will the lights go out in Europe this winter? We're going to be asking Denmark's foreign minister about the implications of an apparent attack on a major gas pipeline. It's Thursday, the 29th of September. Well, the Treasury says it has the right plan to grow the economy despite the market backlash. The Bank of England is forced to spend £65 billion on emergency action to save Britain's pension funds. Also ahead, 20 people missing off the Florida coast and almost 2 million without power after one of the most powerful storms ever recorded.
I'm in Fort Myers, close to where Hurricane Ian came ashore and where coastal communities have been utterly devastated.
A defence source tells Sky News that pipelines carrying Russian gas to Europe were probably attacked with underwater explosives detonated remotely.
Through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left.
The rapper and actor Coolio dies at the age of 59. Also ahead this morning, we'll hear from the Health Security Agency about their fears that Britain could be heading for a flu-COVID twin-demic this winter and why people need to get vaccinated.
You might see me in a Lambo, camel snapback, Rambo, 500 horses, Django, 2 chicken, Nando.
I'll speak to the rapper Lethal Bizzle as he wins an award for pushing grime into the mainstream. Hello, a very good morning to you. The government is insisting there'll be no U-turn on the Chancellor's mini-budget, despite turmoil in the markets. The Bank of England has been forced into emergency action over what it called a material risk to the UK's financial stability. The central bank has launched a £65 billion bond buying programme after a mass sell-off led to a run on British pension funds. Well, let's get the latest from our business correspondent, Paul Kelso, who joins me now. So, Paul, just how unusual was this intervention into the bond market by the Bank of England, which was kicked off yesterday?
Extremely unusual for the bank to wade into the market in the way it has, and even more unusual for a central bank to have to take action to prop up fundamental parts of the economic architecture and structure of the economy because of the actions of a government. The move in the pensions market was a very real threat to the stability of that market, around £1 trillion worth of assets held in various ways that became threatened by the collapse in bond prices. Bonds are supposed to be UK bonds, government bonds are supposed to be the risk-free way of borrowing because you're borrowing against the competence and stability of a government. And UK government bonds, I mean, they were gold-plated, almost literally. They had gilt edges once upon a time, which is why they're called gilts. But the government's move in the budget on Friday, the market's loss of faith subsequently meant the value of bonds halved. It left lots of pension funds exposed. They borrowed against them. Hence, they needed to sell quickly. The price of the bonds fell even more, and the bank had to step in. Now, for now, they do seem to have righted the ship. The run on pensions investments has been averted. But this is a consequence of a lack of faith and a knock to confidence in the UK government's economic plan, its competence, and frankly, the stability of the UK economy. So recovering that confidence in markets is going to take time. We'll start to hear ministers. We began last night. We'll hear more from them today. The Prime Minister will speak today, attempting to explain the economic plan that they set out on Friday, which caused this. And so they will be watching very closely in markets to hear whether the UK's plan makes sense. Very interesting to me that Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, overnight has been critical of the way that plan was set out. And the one thing we still don't know, and in a sense can't know, is what other slightly dark or usually ignored corners of the UK's financial plumbing have been gummed up or have sprung a leak as a consequence of this huge shock to the system that happened on Friday. So much still to play for the government to restore market confidence in their plan.
Paul Kelso, thanks very much indeed. So let's hear from the government now. I'm joined by the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Chris Philp. Good morning to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us.
Good morning.
Emergency budgets are usually designed to solve an emergency. This one seems to have created one.
Well, this was a growth plan designed to get the UK economy growing. Ultimately, the only way that families and households across the UK are going to see their incomes sustainably rising, the only way we're going to see good new jobs getting created, and ultimately the sustainable tax base delivered to fund our public services like police, health, education and so on is by getting our economy growing. That's what the plan aims to do, partly through tax cuts, but also through supply-side reforms. Reducing business regulation, building more infrastructure like road and rail more quickly, building energy infrastructure so we're not dependent on energy imports. Those parts of the plan, I think, all of those together, will get our economy growing and ultimately put us in a much better position.
OK, so you say it's going to be good for people, and yet the reaction on the markets has been horrendous, and people this morning will be waking up. They were already worried about rising bills. Now they're also worried about their mortgages and their pensions as well. So what would you say to them?
Well, look, I think on the question about interest rates and mortgage costs, therefore, by extension, I mean, across the world for the last probably 6 or 9 months, we've seen a rising interest rate cycle. Central banks around the world have put up rates. In fact, the US Federal Reserve have put up interest rates by more than the UK's Bank of England. And that's in response to the inflation, the global inflation caused by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, one of the reasons why this growth package is so important and why it included tax cuts is to alleviate the burden placed on households, and why it also confirmed the energy intervention, making sure that households don't pay, on average, more than £2,500 this winter and indeed for the next 2 years for fuel. Do you remember just a few weeks ago, people were talking about energy bills this winter of £5,000, £6,000, even £7,000 a year? And thanks to that intervention last week by the Prime Minister and by the Chancellor, that is not going to happen. So we've taken that action to protect households at this time of unprecedented global economic difficulty.
Lots of other problems that people now have to worry about.
As I've said, we've seen changes in or turbulence in global financial markets for a number of months, not just here but around the world. The Bank of, your correspondent just a minute ago talked about the Bank of England's intervention yesterday. Of course, the Bank of Japan intervened actually in their currency market just a few days ago. So other central banks are having to take action as well. The Bank of England did what it was supposed to, acting, of course, independently, and it had its desired effect. And by the end of yesterday, the market had settled down again.
You say it's a global problem. The IMF hasn't had to issue a stinging rebuke to any other G7 country, has it?
Yeah, look, I saw the IMF's comments. I respectfully disagree with them. The response that I'm sort of most interested in is the response by British business organisations who represent the businesses, the British businesses that are going to grow, that are going to create these jobs. And if you look at what organisations like the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, the Federation of Small Businesses, the British Chambers of Commerce said last Friday in response to the growth plan, all of them welcomed it really strongly because, speaking for their members, they can see it's going to grow our economy. OK, so business groups liked it. And would you agree that although some of the tax cuts were well received, you just went too far? Well, look, I think on the tax question, I think we had very high levels of taxation and they were due to go up even further. That was the previous plan. In fact, the corporation tax cut wasn't a cut, it was just keeping tax levels where they are and reversing a very recent national insurance increase. Look, the view we take is that in order for an economy to grow, we have to have competitive rates of tax to incentivise investment, but also to encourage both very successful people and also businesses to choose to locate in the UK. So I used to be technology minister until just recently. And, the most successful technology businesses in the world and the most successful technology professionals, coders and so on, they can choose where to locate. They haven't got to come to the UK. And by having a competitive rate of tax compared to other countries, we can attract people to the United Kingdom to make a contribution, to pay their taxes critically, and to help grow the economy and create new jobs.
But the markets were prepared for some tax cuts, but not to this degree. Was it really necessary to scrap the 45p rate, which only benefits the really wealthy anyway? It's not even due to come in until April. It didn't need to be announced now and take people by surprise.
Well, I think a couple of points. Firstly, the top rate of 40%, so now 40%, reducing from 45, makes us internationally competitive. It puts us on a par with a number of other
but it only
economies.
benefits the wealthy.
Well, that's true. It benefits people who earn more than £150,000, but very often those are people who are internationally mobile. They can choose where to locate. I talk to people who have got a choice about whether they work and live in, London or Edinburgh or Birmingham, or whether they go and live in Singapore or New York or somewhere. And we want those people to locate here in the UK. And so one other point, in terms of the size of that measure, it amounted to less than 1/20th, less than 5% of the total fiscal measures. It was a very small part of the package. Most of the measures, like cutting national insurance and cutting the basic rate of income tax, which were the most expensive measures, they made up sort of 80% of it. Those are targeted at everybody. Everyone benefits. You, me, everybody.
But the truth is that the markets weren't properly prepared, were they, for what came at them? And when the mini-budget was announced, it didn't have the OBR's independent assessment of what it meant for the economy and how it was going to be paid for.
Yep.
And that spooked the markets. They were badly prepared, weren't they?
And that's why, I can't comment on markets' preparedness, but I can say...
No, sorry, the markets weren't prepared for what you announced. You didn't prepare the markets, Adam.
Well, I think, quite a few of the measures, particularly the more expensive ones, like the energy intervention to protect households, the national insurance reversal and corporation tax had been sort of quite well trailed in advance. But we are going to do, of course, a full OBR scoring. In fact, we're going to do it twice this year, as we're required to do by law. Once on the 23rd of November.
That's 8 weeks away.
Well, once on the 23rd of November, we want it to be done properly, and again with the spring budget. So there'll be 2 OBR scorings this year, which is required by law. We're also going to be the Chancellor will set out his medium-term fiscal plan, which will ensure that government debt, as a proportion of GDP, the size of our economy, falls over time. Because we are going to do this responsibly. And we should remember, of course, that we start this in a good position as a country because our existing debt to GDP ratio, that's the measure most people use, is the second lowest in the G7.
Gerard Lyons, who you will know, I'm sure, often referred to as Liz Truss's favourite economist, said that Kwasi Kwarteng had failed to adequately prepare the financial markets ahead of this announcement.
Look, I don't accept that. Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, is in constant contact with the markets. He's meeting the Governor of the Bank of England on a very regular basis. I think just yesterday he had meetings together with his colleagues with financial market participants. I think he's had several meetings with them in the last week or so. So I don't think I accept that, but he is in constant contact with market participants.
Doesn't the OBR need to produce its report sooner than the end of November?
Well, look, I think we're going to do this just in an orderly fashion. We've set a very clear date, the 23rd of November. They'll do a full scoring of the measures that have been taken. They'll update their forecasts. Let's just do it in a measured, organised way. That is the right way to approach this, and that's what we'll get on the 23rd, in addition to our medium-term fiscal plan.
Has the government made any mistakes?
Well, no one's perfect, but I think I'm not going to sort of apologise for having a plan to grow the UK's economy, which will increase people's wages, that will create new jobs. I'm certainly not going to apologise for having an energy intervention, which is protecting every single household in this country from what could have been devastating bills this winter.
You say no one's perfect. You acknowledge that some mistakes were made.
Well, look, I'm not going to get into this sort of
why not?
Post facto raking over. But the point I want to make most clearly is the one I just made, which is having a growth plan to grow jobs, increase people's wages, make sure the UK is internationally competitive, introduce supply-side reforms, things like the transport infrastructure, reducing business regulation. All of that will make the whole country ultimately better off. And I say the energy intervention is protecting every single household in this country from what would otherwise have been devastating bills.
You say it's going to make the country better off, but what about public spending? You've asked government departments for efficiency savings, haven't you?
That's right. So on the public spending side, two points to make on how this gets paid for. I mean, clearly growth is part of it. If we grow the economy, it generates more taxes.
How long will that take?
And we set out actually in the Blue Book last week on page 27, it illustrates that if we can get our economy growing by 1% faster than it otherwise would, after 5 years, that generates £47 billion of additional tax revenue. But we're also going to be responsible with public spending, as you just sort of suggested. which means, first of all, sticking within the existing spending limits, the so-called Spending Review 21 limits. That was a review done about a year ago. It covered 3 financial years. We're in the first of those years now. We are going to stick to those spending limits. So the efficiency and prioritisation exercise that you referred to is designed to do 2 things. Firstly, make absolutely sure we stick to those spending limits. And secondly, make sure that we're prioritising expenditure not on anything that's wasteful, but on things that really deliver frontline public services and drive economic growth.
People have heard so many times before efficiency savings being sought from departments. This basically means that all departments are going to face a squeeze, aren't they?
Well, we found about over £3 billion of efficiency savings last year. As I say, we're going to stick to the so-called spending envelope. We're going to stick to those planned spending levels that were set out a year ago over the next 3-year period. But we're going to make sure that we're spending the money in the best possible way, and we're going to make sure we don't exceed those limits.
But with inflation at 10%, your money just isn't going to go as far. And departments like the NHS, like the Health Service, just can't cope, can they? I mean, Charlie Bean, former governor of the Bank of England, said spending cuts made necessary by this mini-budget could finish the NHS.
Well, the NHS has had a record funding settlement, and to be clear, the inflation that is felt by the public sector is different to the inflation felt by sort of you and I as just consumers. It's a lower figure. And even despite the higher inflation that we've seen recently, it's a global phenomenon caused by Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. Despite that, the spending envelope, the spending levels that we're working within will still see real terms increases in public spending, adjusting for public sector inflation, but we are going to stick absolutely rigidly to those spending limits because it is important to be financially responsible.
A lot of people are fairly horrified by what's been going on in the markets, not least Tory MPs, who some publicly, a lot privately, have talked about their discomfort. Should Kwasi Kwarteng resign? No,
I don't think he should. The Chancellor has, I think, set out very clearly a vision for growth, to get our economy growing. That is what we need. And if you think about this in the sort of medium term, what we need is an economy that is delivering the jobs of the future, attracting people and companies from around the world to who are successful to work and to produce jobs here. That is the right plan. And he's fixed. And he and the Prime Minister working together have fixed this energy crisis for families. We would have had bills of £6,000. That's they've intervened to stop that, and that's the right thing to do. And I think families up and down the country will be pleased they've got a Prime Minister and a Chancellor who have taken urgent, decisive action to protect them from the effects of Putin's war when it comes to energy bills.
OK, Chris Philp, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Let's take a look then at how the morning papers are covering this story, many of them focusing, of course, on this crisis in the financial markets. And the Financial Times leads with the Bank of England's extraordinary intervention in an attempt to head off the negative reaction of worldwide markets to the government's mini-budget. The Guardian, their headline, banks £65 billion gamble to avert financial crisis. The Eye describes the move as an effort to save pensions. The Star pictures the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng with the paper joking that he's asking colleagues, does anyone have a clue what I'm doing? Even the Express, which usually supports the government, dubs it a day of turmoil. And the bank's intervention is also the main concern for the Daily Telegraph this morning. And just to let you know that later on today at 12 o'clock, Jane Secker will be presenting a special programme on Sky News about the current crisis in the markets. And she's going to be joined by our economics editor, Ed Conway, our city editor, Mark Kleinman, and our business presenter, Ian King, all giving their expert analysis as well as their insight into the crisis. And you can scan the QR code that you can see on screen right now to put your questions about the crisis to Ed, Mark and Ian, which they will answer at 1:30 as part of that programme. Still to come here on the programme, do stay with us, we've got lots coming up, including with claims that damage caused to a major gas pipeline in the Baltic Sea was an act of sabotage. I'll be speaking to the Danish Foreign Minister, Jeppe Kofod. Well, we just heard from the government. At 8 o'clock, I'll be speaking to Labour's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Pat McFadden. And I'll also get reaction to the market turmoil with the former Treasury Minister, Lord O'Neill. Now, Now, 20 people are missing off the coast of Florida and almost 2 million have been left without power. So let's find out the very latest. Our US correspondent Martha Kellner joins me now from Fort Myers in Florida. So Martha, clearly it's very wet where you are. Tell us just how bad it's been.
Yeah, it is wet. There's still lashing rain and quite strong winds here, but nowhere near as bad as it's been throughout the early hours of this morning and certainly yesterday. Hurricane Ian has now been downgraded to a Category 1 storm as it makes its way across central and eastern Florida, but it was far, far stronger than that when it made landfall not far from here, actually late yesterday afternoon, bringing with it winds well in excess of 100 miles per hour. And it was the water rather than the wind that people were fearing here even before the event. And they were proven correct because it brought with it storm surges of up to 18 feet in certain places. And there are areas of Fort Myers around 5 or 6 miles from here that are still under 4 or 5 feet of water. And we know that people are still awaiting rescue. The city of Fort Myers writing this evening on social media that they're responding to fires, extensive flooding and life-threatening conditions. Here is our report on a devastating day for this part of southwest Florida. For miles along Florida's southwest coast, roads have become rivers. This state is used to hurricanes, but it's as if Ian was designed for destruction. Unusual in strength and size, unleashing its fury here for several hours, sending entire homes and their contents tumbling away. This used to be the main highway in Fort Myers Beach, overwhelmed by a storm surge, a tsunami-like wall of water, more than 10 feet in places. Sanibel Island, usually home to over 6,000 people, and multi-million-dollar mansions swallowed entirely. 2.5 million people were told to evacuate this area, but many stayed behind. Jennifer and her parents were stranded at their house in Fort Myers, eventually rescued by a local in a boat.
The water was just coming in through the cracks, and then the water just kept coming in. Within 10 minutes, the water was up to my chest, within 10 minutes, from ankles to my chest. The door that goes out to the garage actually broke off of the hinges and water just gushing in everywhere. The next thing you know, it's above our heads. We were floating. We're trying to stand on furniture, anything that we could, because it was way above our heads.
What do you think would have happened if that boat hadn't arrived at that point?
I don't think we would be here.
They're taking refuge alongside evacuated residents at this hotel. Soon they'll leave and return home, hoping theirs has escaped the worst of the storm. But for many, they'll be counting the cost of this catastrophe long after the water and wind has subsided. You can see from those pictures there that there's been absolutely catastrophic damage over a wide part of this coast of Florida. There's also inevitably been loss of life as well. So this is a secondary issue, but it may become a more important one. There are 2.2 million people in this area of Florida this evening still without power. They've been without power for several hours now, and it means that there are families, people who are looking for relatives, for friends, and aren't able to make contact with them. It also means that we're not yet getting a clear picture of the extent of damage in certain places. It's only really when dawn breaks that we'll be able to get a true idea of just what path of destruction Hurricane Ian has wrought, but it's certainly been a devastating event, a catastrophic event for this part of Florida, probably the worst hurricane this particular area has experienced in terms of damage, and one of the worst hurricanes that's made landfall anywhere in the United States.
Martha, thanks very much indeed. Now, the US Navy has said it stands ready to provide support to its allies after what defence sources believe was a deliberate attack on gas pipelines in the Baltic Sea. Well, the Nord Stream pipelines are a pair of offshore natural gas pipelines which run deep under the Baltic Sea from Russia to Germany. Nord Stream 1, the first, has delivered gas, but the opening of Nord Stream 2 was suspended in February. The first leak was reported on Monday on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline east of the Danish island of Bornholm. Then on Tuesday, 2 leaks were found on the nearby Nord Stream 1. Well, our international correspondent Alex Rossi joins me now live from Moscow. Alex, suspicions that this was an act of sabotage. So what's Russia saying about it?
Well, Moscow's line is that the allegations that it is behind this, which are being made in some quarters by the Europeans, certainly the Polish have gone on record saying that they blame the Kremlin for carrying out this. We heard from Dmitry Peskov, who is Vladimir Putin's spokesman, and he said that kind of allegation was predictably stupid. So the investigation continues, but of course the focus does centre on Moscow. But there are big questions, Anna, as why would anybody do this? Because although you can see a benefit for the Russians in the sense it makes energy prices go up, it creates political instability in European countries that are supporting Ukraine, it also is a bit of an own goal as well, because they own the pipeline. They, of course, make money off the gas. The gas hasn't flowed even through Nord Stream 1 since the summer. So it is something of an own goal. And the other fact of all of this is that Vladimir Putin can very easily just turn the taps on and off. He doesn't actually need to blow up the infrastructure. So the investigation continues, but there are warnings. We may never really know what has happened until they can get close to those pipes. And at the moment, there's too much methane bellowing out. They won't really be able to do the tests that they need on the lake bed to see if there have been explosives used. So at the moment, it really is something of a mystery.
Alex Rossi, thanks very much indeed. Well, we're going to bring in now the leader of the Liberal Democrats and former Energy Minister, Sir Ed Davey. Very good morning to you, Sir Ed Davey. Thanks very much indeed for talking to us. I will come on to what's going on in the markets in just a moment, but seeing as we've just been talking about these apparent attacks on the Nord Stream pipelines, I wonder what your view was as a former Energy Minister. How concerned do you think we should be about them?
I think we should be very concerned. Listening to Polish and Danish ministers, they do suspect this was an act of Russian terrorism, and it's another threat from the Kremlin to Europe's energy supplies. But we need to stand bold against Russia, supporting Ukraine. And one thing that is some good news is that the pipeline from Norway to Poland that some of us have long argued for, the so-called Baltic gas pipeline, is going to now open earlier than originally planned. So the threat to the energy supplies to Europe, which have a knock-on effect to our country and to gas prices here, that threat is being mitigated, is being dealt with by some good action by our European colleagues in Norway, in Poland, and in Denmark.
But if the Nord Stream pipelines are rendered unusable, what could the impact be on energy supplies to Europe and to the UK?
Well, at the moment, there's almost no gas going through Nord Stream. So I personally think it's likely that Nord Stream may never reopen. And therefore, the energy policy of Europe, of our country, working with our European colleagues, needs to assume that we need to get off Russian energy as fast as possible. That would be good for our security. It would ultimately calm the markets and reduce prices for people, reduce people's bills, and it would help us tackle climate change. And by the way, that's one of my worries about this potential Russian terrorism that we've seen, because this leaking methane will do damage to our climate. I think we need to stand shoulder to shoulder with our European allies.
And Labour's got an idea, hasn't it, to help us wean ourselves off Russian gas and other supplies. They are seeking to establish a new state-owned company, Great British Energy. What do you make of their plan?
Well, Liberal Democrats in government quadrupled Britain's renewable power. We made Britain the world leader in offshore wind. We set up something called the Green Investment Bank, which was a state-owned bank which worked with private investors to get huge amounts of money, tens of billions of pounds of investment to achieve our renewable goals. Regrettably, the Conservatives privatised the Green Investment Bank. They have cut investment in renewables. And so Liberal Democrats support any measures which are going to reverse that. I think actually reinventing the Liberal Democrat Green Investment Bank would probably be the best and quickest solution to massively increasing the renewable investment that we need to see in our country.
So let's turn to the market turmoil. How do you assess this crisis?
Well, first of all, it's a totally unnecessary crisis. This crisis has been caused by the incompetence of this Conservative government. I think there are millions of people out there, your viewers and many more, who are literally terrified about what is happening. They're worrying about the impact on their savings. They're worried about the impact on mortgage rates. And they're not seeing any leadership from this government. I watched your interview with the Chief Secretary of the Treasury earlier, Chris Phelps. He was blaming everyone else but the government. And no one believes him. No one believes this Conservative government anymore. They've lost total credibility. That's why Liberal Democrats have said we need to recall Parliament. The Conservatives need to cancel their conference so they can get back to work, get back to their offices and sort this mess out. They need to come to Parliament next week, reverse the damaging announcements of their budget last Friday and restore confidence and help people who are so fearful out there, give them some reassurance the government's going to regain a grip on economic policy.
And should the Chancellor resign?
Well, personally, I think they should all go. Liberal Democrats have long argued for an early general election, but before that can happen, this crisis has to be fixed. It is no good Conservative ministers going off to their conference next week, going to their cocktail parties, quaffing champagne while the country is in crisis. Liz Truss, Kwasi Kwarteng, and the rest of this amateur bunch need to get back to their offices, stop their conference, and sort this mess out, and come to Parliament and be held accountable. That's what Liberal Democrats want to see on behalf of the British people. We need to turn this utter catastrophe, this self-inflicted wound round, and that means the Conservatives, for once, admitting they have got it very badly wrong.
Sir Ed Davey, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
So, coming up as the Bank of England takes emergency action to avert what it calls material damage to UK financial stability, I'll be speaking to a former economist at the bank about what's next. Let's get you up to date with what's been happening in the markets. Well, speaking to the programme this morning, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury said he would not apologise for the market turmoil that's followed the government's mini-budget. Chris Philp defended the government's plans, saying they are a strategy for growth.
Well, no one's perfect, but I think I'm not going to sort of apologise for having a plan to grow the UK's economy, which will increase people's wages, that will create new jobs. I'm certainly not going to apologise for having an energy intervention which is protecting every single household in this country from what could have been devastating bills this winter.
Well, our political correspondent Tamara Cohen is here with me. So too is Carsten Jung, who I'll be talking to in just a moment. But Tamara, to you first of all. So the government looks like it just doesn't want to back down on this mini-budget.
Well, we're now seeing Treasury ministers being wheeled out to defend the budget. There is no sense that they think anything was done wrong. There were no mistakes. They say it was well received by businesses on the day. And that jars even with what the Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, told Tory MPs on a call the day before yesterday. many jittery Tory MPs worried about their own mortgages as well as those of their constituents. He said perhaps the markets were not prepared for some of the measures that hadn't been trailed in advance, such as the cut to the 45p rate. But Chris Philp there and other Treasury ministers are saying, look, there's no sense of crisis. This is all due to global forces, even though, of course, the view from other countries is this is constrained to the UK. And the IMF have not warned any other countries in this way. He said that the government disagrees with the International Monetary Fund's analysis that this budget deepens inequality and that borrowing is out of control. He says that the government will set out its plans at the end of November. We're also due to hear from the Prime Minister this morning for the first time in about a week. She's going to be doing a round of regional interviews, and if this is anything to go by, she is going to be staunchly defending the measures that she took. But as to the growing anxiety among many people about how they're going to cope with the impact on mortgages, as well as the rising cost of living in other areas, there really wasn't very much reassurance from the Treasury Secretary, and that will worry MPs a great deal. And speaking to some yesterday, really they were saying, we believe that the Conservative Party may have just lost its reputation for economic competence in one fell swoop.
Yeah, and a few of them speaking publicly, but not many at this stage. So let's bring in Carsten Jung. You are a senior economist at the IPPR's Centre for Economic Justice, but you've also worked at the Bank of England and also the IMF as well. So you're very well placed to comment on what's going on at the moment. And we have had an extraordinary week, haven't we? Yesterday, extreme turmoil on the bond market. We've seen the pound falling to record lows against the dollar earlier in the week as well. As we heard there, as Tamara was summing up what the government is saying, they say that we're just one of many countries experiencing pressures like this. Is that right, or are we suffering peculiarly because of the mini-budget?
If you listen to what people in markets are saying and what they're putting out, the view is very clear that this has been due to the mini-budget. The pound fell 4% on the day of the budget, not the day before when the Bank of England made their announcement. So it was clearly a response to the huge fiscal hole that the Chancellor is punching into public finances. Unfunded tax cuts, which are undermining public services, pulling the rug from underneath the economy. So even the International Monetary Fund has come out and has said, this doesn't stack up, it's not sustainable, and moreover, it exacerbates inequality at the time of a cost of living crisis.
If the government had got the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, to issue its report alongside the budget. They do an assessment at times of budgets and financial statements, usually, don't they, where they assess what the impact would be on the economy and how it would be paid for. Would that have made all the difference?
So that was a huge problem, that the government said, we don't want a transparent assessment of this huge fiscal intervention, which what we should have expected. But even if they'd done so, what the OBR would likely have said is, you're punching a 45 billion fiscal hole in the public finances at the time when schools, hospitals, the police will need more cash injections just to stand still in a time of inflation. And the OBR would have said, there might be further cost of living packages needed. The last one cost 15 billion, just to help low and middle earners to stay afloat. And these numbers just don't add up. It's a huge fiscal hole, and the OBR would have said certainly something along those lines. And without the OBR, the markets have made that call.
Well, that statement will now come at the end of November. We will get their word on this, won't they? What should happen now? Would it help if they brought forward that assessment? Would that reassure the markets?
It might assure markets a little bit, but it won't change the fundamentals. These are big numbers. We can't, brush over this and say, oh, if growth is a little bit higher, it'll all be fine. So the OBR's assessment, one way or another, will be quite daunting. And the only way I see to calm markets is to reverse course. Plug these holes, don't cut taxes, which mostly benefit the better off, in a time where we should stand together and we should be increasing taxes in this cost of living crisis, as is discussed elsewhere, if you look at the European Central Bank chief economist, for example, he has said this is the time to increase taxes on those with the broadest shoulders to support those on low and middle incomes. That is sensible economics, and I think this is the only way to reassure markets.
We know that government departments are going to be told today by the Treasury to find efficiencies, to find cuts. How severe will they have to be?
Very severe. So if, on average over the next 5 years, there's this 30 billion hole in public finances, you will have to make big adjustments. And let's not forget, public sector wages have been far below inflation. So these efficiencies could very well mean that nurses, doctors don't have their pay even remotely keep up with inflation. On the contrary, they may further decline. So A, I don't think we can get that much out of efficiencies, and B, we really need to support public services right now in order to, support people that are working for the public sector.
And of course, a lot of people are worried about rising bills. They're worried about mortgages. A lot of mortgage offers are being withdrawn now, and products generally in that market as well. And people are worried about their pensions as well. The government says, hold fire, this is a growth plan, you'll all benefit in the future, and we're protecting you against the worst rises in costs with our energy plan. Can people relax today?
They cannot. I mean, for many, that future may never arrive if it means they're losing their home, if it means they lose their job, or they can't heat their homes this winter. So we're seeing with this fiscal package by the Chancellor, interest rates are now expected by markets to go up to 5-6%. This, for many people on flexible mortgages, this could almost double their mortgage payments monthly. These are huge shocks to people, which we haven't seen in the last 50 years to incomes, and lofty claims about a brighter growth in 5 to 10 years to come, won't help many people right now who are really struggling.
And yet the pound appears to have found a fairly stable level. The intervention by the Bank of England in the bond market yesterday seems to have stabilised that market for now. Is the worst of this crisis over?
So the intervention by the Bank of England showed in what jeopardy they've been put in by the government, because they were in inflation taming mode, where they were trying to take steam out of the economy and increase rates. And what the turmoil yesterday has forced them to do is to pump more money into markets to calm things down. So they are now stuck between a rock and a hard place, having to pump money in, but really they want to be in inflation fighting mode. And I think financial markets are by no means relaxed about this. The pound could well fall further as a result of inflation that is now expected to go even higher.
So we're expecting to hear next formally from the government at the end of November. Do you think they'll have to say something before then in terms of economic plans?
I think so. Financial markets are really concerned, and most importantly, people in the UK are really concerned with their mortgages skyrocketing, mortgage lenders not even giving them out anymore because they don't know where markets will be tomorrow, and inequality skyrocketing because there's being tax cuts for the wealthy, and those on lowest incomes, their incomes are not keeping up with inflation. So real pressures both by financial markets and by ordinary people, which we haven't seen at least since the financial crisis. So waiting till November seems an incredibly long time. I think we need to reverse course now, take back these tax cuts to make sure there is a stable footing for the state to act. And to address some of these problems coming down the line, we even need to increase taxes, for example, on energy producers who are still making windfall profits, as well as others who have broad shoulders.
Well, Carsten Jung, very interesting to get your take on all of this. And Tamara, as ever, thanks very much indeed to you too, of course. Now then, let's return to the damage to the Nord Stream pipeline. And officials in Denmark have been clear in their assessment that the leaks were not caused by accident. Well, the Prime Minister yesterday said that they were the result of deliberate actions, but that it's not yet clear who is behind it. Well, I'm joined now by the Danish Foreign Minister, Jeppe Kofod. So, welcome to you. Tell us exactly what you think happened to the Nord Stream pipelines.
Well, what we can see from all available information is that there's been huge explosions at the pipelines, both Nord Stream 1 and 2, that led to the gigantic leaks that we have seen now. So that is what we know. So it was intentional, not an accident or something like that. And we are now working very hard with all of the countries in Europe, around the Baltic Sea in particular, to establish the facts, so we can investigate what happened here. This is I want to emphasize, this is an international matter concerning all countries around the Baltic Sea and in Europe. It happened in international waters, in our exclusive economic zone and Swedish exclusive economic zone, but it's something that is concerning all of us.
Well, yes, and I noticed that some are sticking their neck out to a certain extent. I noticed that a German opposition politician is saying that it's likely that Russia was behind the attack. Do you agree?
I don't want to go into any speculations on who we could attribute the attack to, but I want to assure everybody that we will investigate, and also with all of our partners in EU and NATO, to ensure that we will establish the facts as we go on. It's very important for us that is done, and we're looking at all the data now. So we will get back to the public when we have more information to release.
And how can the EU and NATO respond, in your view?
Well, I think this is unprecedented. We haven't seen that kind of attack or sabotage on critical European energy infrastructure. And therefore, we do not take this very easy. It's something which we were working closely with our allies in EU and NATO. We came out with also a declaration yesterday morning from EU 27, all EU countries, and we're working with NATO partners. And I've spoken to the US and, of course, a lot of other allies in Europe on this issue, and we'll continue to do until we find out what happened and who did it and why did this take place in the Baltic Sea.
And Norway's Prime Minister has said its military are going to be more visible at oil and gas installations. Is that a move that you support? Is that something that you'd be doing?
It's clear we all need to be very aware of our critical infrastructure when it comes to energy and other infrastructure. So we all take, I think, the right precautionary steps because it is unprecedented, as I've said. We haven't seen that type of attack on infrastructure. This is pipelines running in international waters in the Baltic Sea, Nord Stream 1 and 2, and it's very close to our territories in Sweden and Denmark. So it's something we take very seriously, and therefore we all have to look out for our critical infrastructure.
And of course, Europe's been determined to wean itself off Russian gas, something that's being talked about here as well, of course. What are the implications, do you think, of this damage to the pipelines on supplies?
Well, it's been clear for us for a long time in Denmark and also now for the rest of Europe that we need to get out of any dependence on Russian energy, whether it's gas, coal or oil. And we're working very hard to obtain that objective in Europe. And Denmark is doing its part. We will focus a lot in investing massively in renewable energy, not least offshore wind and other type of renewables, and also energy efficiency. So that is a course we will not change. And I think what happened in the Baltic Sea with Nord Stream 1 and 2 just underline the importance of getting out of dependence of Russia.
Well, Jeppe Kofod, Danish Foreign Minister, thanks very much indeed. We appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Let's take a look now at some of the day's other headlines. And a court in military-ruled Myanmar has convicted Aung San Suu Kyi in another criminal case, receiving a 3-year sentence under the Secrets Act. Australian economist Sean Turnell was sentenced with the former Myanmar leader to 3 years for violating an official's secrets law. Suu Kyi was detained when her elected government was ousted by the army last year. The Labour MP has accused the Labour Party of targeting her, saying she experienced factionalism and racism. Speaking at the World Transformed Festival at the Labour conference, Absana Begum said she received no support from the party when she was subjected to a vote on her deselection while signed off sick from work. 2 aircraft have been involved in a minor collision at Heathrow Airport. Emergency services at the scene said no injuries have been reported, but were attending to ensure that all passengers and crew are safe and well. Now, he may be better known as Alan Partridge on screen, but Steve Coogan's views on modern Britain are far from obvious. The actor has told us that the government's recent tax cuts showed breathtaking audacity. His new film is about a far more ancient ruler, as our entertainment reporter Claire Gregory reports.
I know I can find him.
Who?
Richard.
Richard who?
Sorry, the third.
The king.
His latest film is about an ordinary woman fighting against an establishment that isn't interested in helping her. And Steve Coogan, who's previously campaigned for Labour and the Lib Dems, has told Sky News its themes seem pertinent given the new government's economic plans.
Certainly it's breathtaking that at a time when there are so many vulnerable people out there who are going to be struggling, to see the government give tax breaks to the 1% is breathtaking in its audacity.
The Lost King tells the story of amateur historian Philippa Langley, who led the search for the remains of King Richard III to a car park in Leicester, a find often credited to the city's university.
My guess is that Anthony was adopted and sent to America.
I think I would like to go.
It's not the first time one of Coogan's projects has railed against misogyny. He last teamed up with the director and his co-writer from The Lost King on Philomena, about another woman fighting for the truth.
As a privileged white middle-aged man, there is a question mark of whether I should be telling that story or I should be involved in telling that story. But when you are in that position, it makes you work doubly hard at trying to make sure you do justice to someone else's story.
And the subject of The Lost King says she's just glad her tale is being told.
I think it's an important story to show that, you know, what an ordinary person can do, because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor. And I hope it just inspires, you know, like the young to do something similar.
Sprinkled with humour, this film is ultimately entertainment, but in crediting a middle-aged woman with the discovery of a king, it may just have an impact on the history books as well. Claire Gregory, Sky News.
Now, the rapper Coolio has died at the age of 59.
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left.
Well, best known for his 1990s hit Gangsta's Paradise, the US artist, whose real name is Artist Leon Ivy Jr., was visiting a friend in Los Angeles when, according to his manager, he suffered a heart attack. And tributes have been coming in from fellow musicians all morning. For example, the rapper Ice Cube tweeted, "This is sad news. I witnessed firsthand this man's grind to the top of the industry. Rest in peace." Another rapper, Snoop Dogg, simply said, "Gangsta's Paradise, R.I.P."